Building from this focus on advocacy, we then look to monitoring and review as complementary bases of human rights accountability in global health. Returning to my work with groundbreaking contributors Hanna Huffstetler and Judith Bueno de Mesquita in examining these monitoring and review mechanisms. Chapter 7 discusses the role of monitoring and review mechanisms as a foundation for accountability to ensure human rights implementation to promote global health. Accountability for the implementation of health-related human rights requires an independent means to assess compliance with international human rights standards. How do we know that state ratification of human rights treaties leads to meaningful human rights implementation, leads to meaningful impacts on individual lives? In order to facilitate accountability for human rights implementation, we need monitoring and review mechanisms to provide external oversight of national efforts to promote health and human rights. Now let me turn it over to Hanna Huffstetler to tell you more about the evolution of this interconnected ecosystem of monitoring and review at national, regional, and international levels.
So there's no single centralized body or system for human rights monitoring and review. Instead, and the point we make in the chapter is that oversight for human rights implementation is really structured and reinforced through a range of interconnected mechanisms that exist across multiple levels of governance. These different mechanisms form what we conceptualize in the chapter as an ecosystem of monitoring and review. Each level of this ecosystem existing at national, regional, and international levels employs complementary structures and methods to not only assess state efforts to advance human rights, but also consider complaints of human rights violations, to make recommendations on how to improve implementation, as well as clarify treaty provisions for states. So at the national level, these mechanisms include bodies like national human rights institutions, which are given the authority to review government actions and make recommendations to ensure that the state is meeting their human rights obligations under international law. At the regional level, mechanisms which are established through regional intergovernmental organizations like the African Union, for example, include regional human rights commissions, which monitor regional human rights treaties and provide some oversight where domestic monitoring and review might fall short. And lastly, at the international level, mechanisms to monitor and review human rights are facilitated through the United Nations. These include the UN human rights treaty bodies, which oversee the implementation of specific international human rights treaties. This also includes special procedures focused either on the human rights situations of particular countries or specific human rights issues, such as the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health. And it also includes the Universal Periodic Review, which I will hand it over to Professor Bueno de Mesquita to talk about.
The Universal Periodic Review was launched by the UN Human Rights Council in 2008. It's a peer review procedure, which means that states assess and make recommendations to each other, reviewing the human rights situation in all states every 4 to 5 years. The procedure is really critical because it's the only one within the UN which holds all states to account for all human rights. So some of the other procedures which Hanna was just referring to, they either have more limited engagement by states or cover only selected rights. So with so many rights to review, how much attention does the procedure give to the right to health? Well, the good news is that our chapter highlights that in its first 2 cycles, the Universal Periodic Review gave a great deal of attention to the right to health, with respectively 22 and 25% of its recommendations having a health focus. This is a really significant number and illustrates the relevance of the procedure for the right to health, as it provides a prominent forum to enhance state accountability for and also provide guidance through its recommendations to states on how they can comply with international human rights law. Yet the procedure is not without fault, and our research found that the recommendations were framed too generally. They didn't provide very precise guidance about what was expected of states. Moreover, recommendations have tended to be clustered around prominent and well-known health and human rights issues, such as maternal and child health, while paying very little attention to other critical issues like mental health. The work provides analysis that can help. Our research provides analysis that can help shape the UPR as it continues through its third cycle and beyond.